Alright, welcome everybody to episode 2 of How To, an intro to magic. Um, in the first episode, we went over the card colors, how to read a card, and then some of the more basic card types, creatures, instants, and sorceries. Those are the main cards that are typically played in order to win. So now we're going to go into some of the other card types that exist, starting with artifacts. Okay, there are a lot of cards that say destroy artifacts. So let's start. Let's just take this one. All right, so Glass Casket. It's one in a white, which means you'd have to tap one white source and one of whatever you want and one of any miscellaneous color to cast it. And what it says is, when Glass Casket enters the battlefield, exile target creature an opponent controls with converted mana cost 3 or less until Glass Casket leaves the battlefield. So artifacts are like creatures in that when they're played, they don't immediately go to the graveyard. So they're played, they stay on the battlefield, and they're there until they're destroyed or exiled or something like that. A really good, and a reason also why choosing Glass Casket is kind of a good one, is that a lot of the times you'll see this term converted mana cost, and you might be thinking to yourself, okay, what is converted mana cost? So if you look at the converted mana cost, or the mana cost of Glass Casket, you see it's 1 in a white, which means its converted mana cost is 2. So the converted mana cost is basically what is the total amount of mana needed to cast that spell. In this case, for Glass Casket, it's 2. For Acclaimed Contender, its converted mana cost would be 3. Then the next card type we're going to look at is enchantments. Enchantments are just like creatures and artifacts. When they're played, they stay on the battlefield until they're destroyed. They don't go into the graveyard. So for this case, and usually artifacts and enchantments usually tend to have a passive ability, meaning that they're not an activated ability. Some do have activated abilities, which we'll also get into that in a second as well. But in this case, this is considered a passive ability because you don't have to pay any mana to activate it. It just happens. So in this case, whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life. So there are things like whenever each player, what's another good one? During your upkeep or during an upkeep, those are usually indicators of some kind of passive ability. In the case of, say, Sanctum of Tranquil Light, which is also an enchantment, it has an activated ability to it, which costs a total of 6 mana, 5 in the white, to activate. So whenever you see any kind of, whether it's the tap symbol, whether you see that there's some kind of mana cost in the text box, will usually tell you that it's an activated ability of some kind. Then the last one, which is probably one of the most important because they see play pretty much all the time, and we're going to take my favorite Planeswalker and we'll take a look at him. So these are called Planeswalkers. Just like creatures, artifacts, and enchantments, they're played and they stay on the battlefield. However, you'll see here that they have 3 different activated or loyalty abilities. In the case of Planeswalkers, they're called loyalty abilities because what this in the lower right hand corner is this Planeswalker's loyalty. So how does this work? So to activate a loyalty ability, you have to be able to pay that loyalty cost. In this case, this is a +1. So let's say you play Nicol Bolas, Dragon God. Unlike creatures where you can't activate their abilities the turn they're played, unless they have haste, you can activate Planeswalker's abilities the turn they're played. So in this case, Nicol Bolas would enter with 4 loyalty. You would use his plus ability, which would take his loyalty up to 5, and then you would utilize his ability. Otherwise, let's say instead you didn't want to draw a card, you wanted to destroy a creature or planeswalkers instead. He would enter, you'd activate his ability, which would -3, so he'd go down to 1 loyalty to destroy a creature or a planeswalker. Now, if, let's say, Nicol Bolas's loyalty was at 2, you cannot pay his cost because he doesn't have 3 loyalty to lose. Now, if he's at 3 loyalty, you can activate his ability, his loyalty goes to 0, and then Nicol Bolas will go to the graveyard. So whenever a Planeswalker's loyalty goes to 0, that Planeswalker dies. Now, when you're in combat, typically players will attack you. However, they have the option to, if there's a Planeswalker in play, to attack you or to attack a Planeswalker. You'll find that there are certain cards, let's say Shock for example, where it says deal 2 damage to any target. When it says any target, it means it can target a creature, it can target you, or it can target one of your Planeswalkers. There are some spells that say specifically deal damage to target creature or target player. Recently, there was an idea where there was like redirect, but that's been completely kind of worked out because it was super convoluted. So now, if you want to target a Planeswalker, that card will say deal 2 damage to either target Planeswalker, or it'll say deal 2 damage to any target. So those are Planeswalkers. If we go back, you'll find that usually also, well, most of the time, well, what's kind of recent is that Planeswalkers from certain sets also have passive abilities as well as their activated abilities. So take Nicol Bolas, for instance, where he can use the loyalty ability of any other Planeswalker that's on the battlefield. So it's also really good. Usually this bottom ability is called their ultimate, and is usually game ending. In Nicol Bolas's case, it actually is game ending because they lose the game if you activate it. But then take, say, the other Nicol Bolas, God Pharaoh, where his ultimate is -12, where he exiles each non-land permanent your opponent controls. So actually not super, like, game ending, but still pretty good. What's also important, and you'll see that there are cards that say Legend, so in this case, Legendary Planeswalkers. So what this means is any card that says Legend, you cannot have, any card that is a Legend, you cannot have more than one of on the battlefield. So if you have, and that goes for Planeswalkers as well, so if you have, say, a Nicol Bolas the Ravager in play, you can't have a second one. If you do, you can play the second one, because this Nicol Bolas does have an enter the battlefield effect. So you can play the second one, but then what happens is, after this ability, well, actually no, state-based effects, one of the Nicol Bolases would go to the graveyard, but you would still technically get the ability of the new Bolas if that's the one you kept. But you would be able to choose which one you want to get sent to the graveyard. Same thing goes with Planeswalkers. If you have you can't have any Planeswalker with the same name. So you can have 2 different Bolas Planeswalkers, but you can't have 2 Nicol Bolas Dragon Gods in play at the same time. And that goes with any legendary creature. So let's take Tomik, Distinguished Advocate. You can't have more than one of him in play at a time. So now getting into abilities. So there are a crap ton of abilities or keywords that you'll see on Magic cards. So let's start with one I brought up earlier, which is Haste. Alright, so Raging Goblin. Stats aren't great, it's a 1-mana 1/1. So not great, but it does have haste. And so what haste says is that a creature with haste can attack and can tap as soon as it comes under your control. The reason why they distinguish attack and tap is there are cards that do say tap. There are things called equipments and enchantments, which we will also get to in a minute, that can be activated, that have abilities that can be activated by tapping. So basically this just allows for a creature to attack basically the turn it's played. Then getting into next one, which also has to do with combat or attacking, is Vigilance. So what this means is that attacking doesn't cause this creature with vigilance to tap. What this means is, so whenever a creature attacks, it's tapped, so it's turned sideways. Any creature that is tapped cannot block. So what this means is that this creature can attack and then also block when your opponent attacks. Next up is, let's go with Prowess has recently changed to be an evergreen ability, which evergreen ability means that it's going to be constantly in sets or in new printed Magic cards. It's not, say, a set specific ability. So what Prowess says is that whenever you cast a non-creature spell, this creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn. So basically, literally, if you cast sorcery, instant, planeswalker, enchantment, artifact, it doesn't matter. As long as it's not a creature, this creature, any creature with prowess will get +1/+1 until end of turn. And those prowess, technically triggers, do stack. So if you cast 3 non-creature spells that turn, this creature would get +3/+3. Next, we have Flying. So Flying says a creature with Flying can't be blocked except by creatures with Flying or Reach. So that one's kind of self-explanatory. So it can attack. The only things that can ever block it are things with Flying and Reach, which gets us into Reach, which Reach says a creature with Reach can block creatures with Flying. So that's pretty much what Reach is. The next one, which isn't super relevant but kind of important, is called Defender. And so a creature with Defender, which as it kind of sounds, a creature with Defender can't attack. Usually people will pair this with other cards that do allow you to get around Defender. And a lot of cards that have Defender usually have a workaround. And usually Defenders are walls, but sometimes they'll be other card types as well. Next we have Flash. So usually spells, or usually creatures or enchantments, can only be played during your turn and at sorcery speed. Meaning if your opponent plays a spell, you can't respond to it like you can with instants. However, Flash changes that. So you may cast a spell with Flash anytime you could cast an instant. So if your opponent casts a spell, in response, you can cast a card with Flash. Next is another battle-based ability called Lifelink. So Lifelink says that damage dealt by a creature, planeswalker, or spell with Lifelink also causes its controller to gain that much life. So take Anointed Chorister for instance. When it deals damage to something, it will deal 1 damage because its power is 1. You will gain 1 life. Next up is another battle-based ability called Death Touch. So Death Touch says that any amount of damage a source with Death Touch deals to a creature is enough to destroy it. So if you have a creature, so this one, for example, is a 1/1. Let's say it was dealing damage to, let's just go to the extreme, and let's say it's dealing damage to like a 10/10. Since it has Death Touch, this 1 damage would be enough to kill it. Typically, a lot of cards that have Death Touch usually tend to have a low amount of power, because they have Death Touch, so obviously they don't need a high power in order to kill something. Next is Trample. So usually whenever you deal damage to a creature, whenever like you declare attacks and then somebody blocks, usually that creature absorbs all the damage. However, with Trample, all that damage isn't absorbed. So if you, let's take Phyrexian Obliterator. Phyrexian Obliterator just also kind of complicates things. But okay, let's take Demon of Catastrophes. So Demon of Catastrophes attacks is a 6/6. Let's say someone has a creature with flying or a creature with reach, and let's say that that creature is a 2/2. Typically, if Demon of Catastrophes didn't have trample, all 6 of that damage would be absorbed by that 2/2. However, with trample, it deals the lethal amount of damage. So trample states that a creature with trample can deal excess combat damage to the player or planeswalker it's attacking. So if the blocking creature has 2 toughness, 2 out of 6 of Demon of Catastrophes power will be dealt to it, and then the remaining 4 will be dealt to either a creature or a planeswalker, depending on which one you were attacking. So that is trample. Next is First Strike, which, as First Strike says, or as it sounds, so this creature deals combat damage before creatures without First Strike. So when you go into combat, there are multiple steps. So you go into combat, then there's declare attackers, then there's declare blockers, and then usually creatures deal damage simultaneously. An attacking creature will do damage to the same time as that blocking creature does damage to it. However, First Strike changes that. When a creature has First Strike, there's another phase in before regular damage, where it's called First Strike damage, where that creature will deal its damage before the other creature has an opportunity to deal theirs. So for instance, usually Eidolon of Obstruction would die in a battle with, say, a 1/1 if it didn't have First Strike. However, since Eidolon of Obstruction has First Strike, it will deal its 2 damage to a creature before that creature has the ability to, say, deal its 1 damage to it. So First Strike is a great way to kind of to kill creatures without them being able to kill yours. And following First Strike is another ability called Double Strike. So Double Strike says this creature deals both First Strike and regular combat damage. So take Fencing Ace. So if it were to go to battle with a 1/1, it would deal that didn't have First Strike. It would deal its 1 damage and kill that creature. Now let's say it was attacking and someone blocked with like a 2/2. So during First Strike damage, it would deal its 1, so that creature would have 1 damage dealt on it. However, now this creature attacks again during regular combat damage, where it would deal another 1 and kill it. However, since that blocking creature didn't die during First Strike damage, since we're now in regular damage, both creatures will now deal its damage again simultaneously, so now Fencing Ace and the 2/2 would die. So what's important with Double Strike is that basically take whatever creature this power is, and then basically double it. So if somebody wasn't blocking this Fencing Ace, they would take a total of 2 damage. Then take something like Zatulba, who basically has alphabet soup when it comes to abilities. It would deal a total of 8 damage because it's a 4/8. So it would deal its damage twice, so the opponent would take 8 damage. Next ability is Indestructible. What's a good example of Indestructible? Sure, let's take this one. So this is Heliod Suncrowned, and its ability is Indestructible. So what this says is that effects that say destroy don't destroy a permanent with Indestructible, and if it's a creature, it can't be destroyed by damage. So any effect that says destroy target creature would not destroy a creature with Indestructible. And let's say if Heliod blocked something that was a 10/10, it wouldn't be able to kill Heliod. So the workaround to Indestructible is that since it says it can't be destroyed, the workaround for that is something like Vraska's Contempt, where it says exile target creature or planeswalker. Since it's not being destroyed, it's being exiled. It can be removed from play via exile, but not via effects that say destroy. But those are definitely now, with these new additions, now let's take a look also at a subcategory of enchantments and a subcategory of artifacts. So these are enchantments that are subtyped or that are classified as auras. So what auras are is that they are enchantments that get attached to a creature, or usually a creature. And so in this case, what this particular aura does is that enchanted creature gets +1/+1 for each artifact or enchantment you control. So that's usually how these enchantments work. They'll specify what they enchant. So this one says enchant creature. There are others that say various things, but most of the time when you're dealing with auras, it usually says enchant a creature. And then artifact or equipments work similarly. And just like previous, just like other enchantments, they're not, auras aren't destroyed, or auras are only destroyed when the creature that they're attached to are destroyed, or if someone destroys the aura specifically. Next we have equipments, which are a subclass of artifacts that have an equipment cost. So like other artifacts, they enter the battlefield, they're not removed, or they're not immediately sent to the graveyard. They're what are called permanents. Then you can pay this equip ability, and equip says you may pay the equip cost to attach this permanent to a target creature you control, and you can only equip at sorcery speed. And just like typical enchantments, you can only enchant a creature with an aura at instant speed, or at sorcery speed, sorry. Unless it says flash, which there are some auras that do say that. But unlike auras, if a creature with an equipment attached to it is destroyed, the equipment stays in play, so you can re-equip it to a different creature later. So, take, Malefic Scythe. If a creature was equipped with this and that creature was destroyed, that creature would go to the graveyard, but Malefic Scythe would stay in play, and you could equip Malefic Scythe to another creature. So those are kind of the remainder of abilities and other card types. There are a vast more number of abilities that exist, because usually each new set will have keywords that are specific to that particular set. There were some from, what was it, Ikoria, that had this ability called Mutate. From Throne of Eldraine, there was an ability called Adventure. So now, taking into conjunction kind of the new card types we saw, I think this deck had a good mix of everything, except for, I think, artifacts, which it didn't have a lot of. But it did have everything else in it. So we'll take this Historic Grixis Control. Through a league real quick. Or, not through a league, but through a match real quick. To kind of show how Planeswalkers and enchantments work. Most of the time, a lot of decks don't really play too many artifacts. It's probably the artifacts and enchantments are usually the least common card types played. If they are played, they're typically played in the sideboard, or they're typically played. Enchantments usually technically be like a win condition, and artifacts are usually almost played in the sideboard. There are some that are played main board as, say, like removal spells or something like that, like the one I showed previously. That artifact was played main board quite often. Alright, So our opponent's going to Thoughtseize us, which Thoughtseize basically says take a card from an opponent's hand and put it into the graveyard. I imagine they're also playing looks like they're playing Grixis of some kind. Keep a land, and now we're going to Thoughtseize them. Most of their hand we don't care about, except for Narset, so let's take that. They can't currently cast the Bedevil because they have no red mana, so the Bedevil is currently a dead card in their hand. They might even... oh, nope, they're not gonna censor. Thoughtseize. Response. We're going to cycle this. So cycle is another kind of keyword, where cycle basically says put this card, pay the cycle cost, put the card into your graveyard, and then draw a card. So they're taking Eliminate. Sure. So they have a Censor in hand. So since Censor says counter target spell, unless that controller pays 1, we're not going... so they kept whatever card that was, which means it's probably land. However, now we have a Narset. So now here is a Planeswalker. So Narset has a passive ability where each opponent can draw more than one card each turn. And this is a different kind of Planeswalker because this one's an uncommon, and uncommon Planeswalkers only have one ability. This is uncommon Planeswalkers were new to this set called War of the Spark. You'll also see that there are rare Planeswalkers that have 2 abilities. You can tell that it's an uncommon because its symbol is silver. Commons are black, have a black symbol in their corner. So we're going to activate this ability. Since it starts at 5, we activate its ability. It's going to go down to 3 loyalty, which means we can activate its loyalty only 1 more time. Since this allows us to take any non-creature spell, we're going to take this Thoughtseize, and then we're going to Thoughtseize them. They're going to cycle Censor. The Languish is irrelevant, so we're going to take the Bedevil. Play that tapped, and swing in for 1. If you'd like the Languish here, he's more than welcome to. Seems kind of bad, but he can do it if he so wishes. About to say he doesn't. Activate Narset. We're gonna take this Sinister Sabotage. We're gonna make this a black source since we have a bunch of blue currently. And we're going to go to combat and we're going to attack for 1. So he's probably gonna cast a Lock Point at his end step to draw a card. But then he'll take 3 damage. Sure. We have the Sinister Sabotage, which can counter a spell. And then we surveil 1. We're actually just gonna counter this. He'd probably take it regardless. So we're just gonna counter it now. Mystical Dispute. Sure. Nicol Bolas. can't languish. Narcissus is not really doing anything now, so no blocks. If he draws a land though, he can activate Nicol Bolas' ability, and that could be a problem for us. Though Extinction Event is pretty good. I'm going to swing in for 1. We're going to activate Extinction Event. We're going to name Even. So this is important for overall CMC. So its converted mana cost is 4, which means we're going to exile all permanent or all creatures that have an even CMC. Tokens have 0 and 0 is even, so we're going to lose our token here. But I will more than happily take this trade. Now he's going to activate Castle Locthwain. He's going to go to 3 life, and now probably can't really activate Castle Locthwain for the remainder of the game. Now he's going to Shark Typhoon, and I'm going to Mystical Dispute this. Now we're going to play this Temple of Epiphany. Bottom that. Another Nichols. Thought Archer. Take Languish. The fact that he drew another Nicol Bolas is kind of impressive. He can't activate the castle, so he, like but he can't do this though. That seems very bad though. Card in my graveyard you'd like to bring back. Now he's putting himself at 1 life. I don't know if I agree with that decision.
Once again. All the cosmos are mine to control.
Sure. Alright. So now, that's pretty much how Planeswalkers work. Usually if your opponent has a Planeswalker in play, usually you probably want to answer it as quickly as you possibly can. If left unchecked for a few turns, a lot of Planeswalkers can completely run away with the game. So always be conscientious of those if your opponents ever have them in play. So that is it for this episode. Make sure to like it, leave a comment, and if you're interested in getting your friends into Magic, make sure to have them watch this episode and then the previous episode as well. I will see you guys on the future episode, and hope you guys